Welcome to the fourth in our series on European Union legal organization. It's a series where we've spent a bit of time talking about the history of the European Union, the organization as an entity of the European Union, the legal functioning of the European Union, and today we're going to talk more about crises. But we covered a lot in our first three sessions, and we thought it would be helpful to spend about 30 minutes to go over and recapitulate some of the things that we already discussed. So we mentioned that the European Union is the European continent, sorry, is composed of a number of different unifying organizations. And the European Union is one among many of these organizations in which there are many subordinate organizations. Oh, we didn't press the record button. No, it's recording. Anyway, so yeah. So anyway, so you've got all these different European organizations, and the European Union is one of these. It tends to group a lot of different countries, but as we can see, things like the Eurozone include countries that are not part of the European Union, in the sense that for example, Montenegro and Kosovo use the euro, but they're not from there. I have a comment that that's not the Guam flag. Guam isn't represented here. All right. Oh, GUAM is a particular Russian-oriented organization. It's a defense league, I think. But of course, now that Ukraine is in the middle of its political situation, the GUAM does not include Ukraine anymore. The flag above it is the flag of Moldova. Okay. And to just sort of hammer home that point, right, you can see on this map, I've color coded it. The countries that are in brown are part of the European Union, are part of, sorry, let's do it from the basis. If it's part of the European Union, it will have blue in its color, right? So that's brown or purple or blue or green. If it's got red in its color, it's part of Schengen region. If it's if it has yellow in its color, it has the euro. And you can see there's a lot of different variations of ways that you can be part of the European Union constituent entities or the European constituent entities. And there is this sort of overlapping set of agreements because each one was entered to on an individual basis, and there wasn't sort of a ground up organization of one constitution for the European Union. You had different countries acceding at different points. And what the European Union did through the Maastricht Treaty was that it organized a number of different subcommittees into what would become the European Union. And the Lisbon Treaty ended the pillar structure of under the Maastricht Treaty, right? These organizations were kept separate, but were bundled together into the European Union. You can think of almost like a fascist or a bundle of grain, right? You've got a tie holding all these organizations together, but the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007 to 2009 really reunified these into one constituent entity, the European Union as we have it today. And so we went through the history that starting in the 1950s, starting right after World War II, there was a real desire to bring peace to the continent, and that resulted in the Council of Europe, which is a wholly separate thing from the European Union as today constituted. And it functions more as a court that sets out human rights and precedent. And you can see here, this is the European Court of Human Rights. We discussed a lot more about this in the first entry into this series. We then had an alliance between France and Germany because the Council of Europe was primarily an English, Swiss operation with some buy-in, of course, from the continent, but the European coal and steel community was primarily between France and Germany. And Aaron's definitely going to get into the details about why Britain was not a part of this part in the early process. So you have the European coal and steel community with the fundamental idea that if this trade of coal and steel can be regulated, then it will prevent wars from reoccurring because those are the fundamental building blocks of military aggression. And so this was a huge move right after World War II, really, it's only 5 years after, that we have the Schuman Declaration on the 9th of May, 1950, that brings together the Benelux countries, France, Germany, and Italy, in this new initiative to trade coal and steel. And they build on this in 1957 with two additional treaties, the Treaty of Rome, which becomes reknown as the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union with its amendments since 1957, which calls for a single market between all the member states of this European Economic Community. That's the first time that title is used. And we also have Euratom, which is a European Atomic Energy Community to facilitate the building of nuclear reactors and other atomic research within the European continent. Eventually, the single common market it wasn't created in 1957. There were a number of particular safeguards on national economies at that point, and they were slowly eroded away so that by 1993, you had what was effectively a single market for most commodities. There are still some nationalist protections, especially concerning agriculture in France, but on the majority of things, you have this sort of integrated economy. And so we see in the early part of the European Union that we have sort of three tracks that things are going on. The first is that as a result of World War II, the European continent wants to avoid all-out war and is seeking integration to avoid that problem, especially in the wake of the Cold War beginning. You also see the foundational entities of the European Union being developed. And finally, and probably most important to our conversation today, is the trajectory of development. So we have the European Union expanding to more states. That's called widening. We have a number of different faculties being granted to these economic communities, these supranational entities, right, beyond the nation state. And that's called a deepening, how the European Union and its institutions, at this point, the European Economic Communities, but it would become the European Union, are increasing their power, their growth in terms of what things they can do, what competencies they have, and the creation of overlapping regional arrangements, right? We talked about Schengen, we talked about the Eurozone. These are regional arrangements that don't affect the entirety of the EU and even affect members that are outside, states that are outside of the European Union. But you have these different agreements to sort of facilitate even more integration outside of an EU level. Right, we talked about Schengen for a moment. This is the abolition of borders between the Schengen states. But even though that's the physical manifestation that most people see, at a fundamental level, this was a reorganization of information sharing, because you have the polices in the various member states now sharing information, creating unified systems of security, customs, and exchange. You really can't have a free market if people can't move and transport goods freely between the different countries. And so Schengen is incredibly important for preventing this from becoming effectively the wild, wild west of legal situations, right? Because if you commit a crime in Germany and you can just waltz across the border to France, but there's no information sharing between Germany and France, it becomes very difficult to catch criminals. So you have a lot of these organizational internal treaties that go along with that physical manifestation of open borders. Then in 1992 to 1993, we have the Maastricht Treaty, which, as I pointed out, brought all these different previous treaties together under one umbrella, sort of tying them all together like that bundle of grain, as I said before. And they established the criteria by which widening, right, incorporating more member states can occur. And that was for countries where you had democratic institutions, countries where they had market economies that could be part of the common market project, and the ability to actually implement the political, economic, and social aims of the European Union. And so there would be an analysis for candidate countries as to whether they met these Copenhagen criteria, these requirements to demonstrate that they could indeed be part of the European Union. We then saw that as part of that development of the common market was the development of the common currency. And the euro was introduced in a number of separate waves, right? We saw in our first session that first, the local currencies were indexed to the euro, they were pegged to the euro. So it would be the case that 2 Deutschmarks would be 1 euro. And that was a fixed rate, but the Deutschmarks were still in circulation and the euros were used for non-paper money, right? Bonds and other kinds of issuance. Eventually, those coins were phased out of circulation so that you had only euros in circulation. And then, of course, you had the widening, right? If you look at the map, the countries in blue are countries that immediately took to the euro. Countries in yellow are countries that are trying to incorporate the euro. Either took to the euro or have taken to it now. Countries in yellow are countries that are not meeting the economic criteria to implement the euro. Countries in green have special agreements about when they will implement the euro because their economies are not at the right situation. Denmark is a unique situation. Like the United Kingdom, Denmark has an opt-out with regards to the euro. Of course, the opt-out for the United Kingdom is sort of a null point now that they left the European Union under Brexit. And you can see actually Montenegro and Kosovo are users of the euro, but are not actually party to any of the agreements. They just use it as a functionality that they never set up their own currency. Now, there's a question, how does a market economy work with a common currency when you have very different levels of development in the countries, and how do they plan to do that? There are several different things, and I think Aaron can also add to the comment here. The first thing is that different countries would print different quantities of euros, and those quantities of euros would be correspondent to the power of their local economies. For example, Germany prints 1/3 of all euros in circulation. A country like Slovenia, on the other hand, prints less than 1% of all euros in circulation.
Yeah, and the way you almost want to think about it is the ECB, basically the central bank of the EU, basically sets these very stringent guidelines in, let's just say, the smaller states in terms of the amount of relative, currency and fluctuations of monetary velocity inside that state. So a place like Slovenia couldn't try to, turn itself overnight into the Switzerland of the monetary union. The ECB would pick up on that, pretty quickly. So that's hopefully that answers your question. Whereas on the flip side, really the Germans could do that. Actually, they just have chosen not to.
I would say that another piece that's sort of missing in this discussion, and we talked more about it in the first session, is that it didn't the introduction of the euro into a lot of lower developed countries like Slovenia, like Slovakia, like the Baltic region countries, resulted in a lot of industries in those countries shutting doors and destabilization in the more skilled industrial parts of their economies, car production, kitchen appliance production, things like that. And so
that's a great point. I mean, you bring up a great point, which is almost the similar deindustrialization that a lot of people are aware of that's happened in big swaths in the middle of or in certain parts of the central United States.
You mean the Rust Belt?
Well, it's really in some ways broader than the Rust Belt, actually, but you could say sort of that metropolis sort of area from southern central Canada all the way down into the Great Plains, and you've had a very similar type of deindustrialization in what's called the banana, which is everything that stretches from basically Barcelona on the Spanish side all the way over into basically far eastern Italy, northern Italy, and so there's been a massive deindustrialization there. And so you have that in different parts of the world, obviously, but in Europe, I think it's been pretty consequential, and there hasn't been much policy action, to be honest. I think they're probably 10 years behind the United States on this, and potentially the earthquakes associated with it politically.
Yeah, no. And in terms of who sets the common monetary policy of the European Union, as Aaron said, it's the European Central Bank. Mark, did you want to make a comment?
Oh yeah, yeah. Just as a comment, that the fact that they created a common currency without truly integrating all the economies in, in terms of what the individual government spent and their levels of wealth is kind of, for the lack of a better word, a an original sin of the euro, and it's hard. It creates inherent uh, problems that
That's right.
manifested themselves during the Great Recession, and it's an ongoing problem because the differences in wealth between, say, Greece and the Netherlands is much bigger than, say, Florida and New York.
Absolutely. And
Absolutely.
you can make an argument that the Greeks are one of the most unfairly punished sort of economic states of the last 15, 20 years in the world in terms of what transpired in the last, especially from 2000, say 6, 7 through 2014, 15. You could say it was a complete deconstruction of the Greek economy. And this was sort of the drive. Nobody sat out and said, we're going to go do this to Greece, independent of what people might want to believe. It's just the fact that everybody knew that, you compare Greece to Bavaria and you look at the state support and the sort of policy support that a place like Bavaria gets versus what Greece gets. It's just a massive mismatch, as Mark was
Yeah.
stating. And there's no mechanism, and there's not a desire for a mechanism to actually compensate for that.
Yeah.
It
No,
was. So go ahead.
I was just going to say that when the euro was originally implemented in 1999, the European Union tried to get as many countries to sign up as they could, regardless of the economic guardrails, and with a callous disregard, at least in my view, of the economic guardrails. Because as soon as they had set up that set of 12, every additional country that would join the Eurozone was thoroughly scrutinized before it would become part of that zone. And if Greece had been subject to that same level of scrutiny, they never would have been adopted in the euro. They would have been similar to Hungary or Poland,
Yeah.
where these countries are still not using the euro. Anyway, Mark,
And you could make an argument, and I'll let you move on from there. And I've actually made this argument that nobody wants to hear on this, is that the Greeks would have been far better off not being in the EU at a monetary fiscal level, and then they could have joined at the, let's say, political and sort of broader policy, justice, et cetera. The old, couple, one and a half of the old three pillars, and they would have economically been, probably realistically twice as wealthy as they are now, at least, if not
I,
more.
I think that's correct. Mark?
Yeah, just a quick thing to you can break it down to a very basic level between political motivations and economic motivations. There are people who wanted to, the European effort to expand as much as possible and expand the institutions, the importance of the institutions. And on the other hand, you had more, how would you say, more
Conservative.
level-headed economists who saying, hey, these guys aren't ready for this. You're stretching things too far for political reasons. We really should keep this to a, like a different, a Europe at different speeds. And then the more politically motivated would say, oh, that's not fair. You shouldn't do that. Right. You shouldn't marginalize these countries. But they stretched it too far, and you had some chaos, and it's that's still right. An inherent problem.
And I would argue this is the conversation that anybody that wants to talk about EU should have is, will and does EU have the appetite for a multi-tiered ascension and sort of development process?
Well, that puts us directly in the next sort of stage that we discussed when we were talking about history, which is the eastward expansion, right? That in 2004, about 9 countries were added to the European Union, 9 or 10 countries moving east. And some of those countries, like Estonia, were not really seen as issues. Countries like Poland, with a large worker force, were, and that created tensions within the European Union about whether these countries could be acceptable. I have a comment about the Polish plumber. This was in reaction to a lot of French propaganda against the integration of these additional member states in 2004 was that Polish plumbers would stream across the border, start working in France, and put all French plumbers out of work. And so the Polish government, after Poland had become part of the EU, and a lot of those fears had been shown to be for the wrong country, right? You had mass Polish immigration to the UK, not to France, but they had this ad in France of a Polish plumber looking incredibly sexy, saying, "Why don't you come to Poland? We have a lot of plumbers," you know. So I think that's actually really cute that they were able to play that game. And then
Yep.
moving on from 2004, we get to 2007, where we start having the Treaty of Lisbon, and we're probably gonna focus a bit on Treaty of Lisbon because that sets up the current organization of the European Union. It's not a constitution; it's still a treaty, and it's a treaty that builds on previous treaties. So rather than creating a clean start to a new way of understanding the European Union, it effectively crystallizes the system that already exists and provides a standardization metric for those things that already existed. You can see, for example, with the picture on the upper right-hand side, the three pillars under the Maastricht Treaty get unified into the European Union under the Treaty of Lisbon as a singular entity. And then there were several crises. When we talk about EU governance, right, we have sort of three things that are really important to bear in mind. The first is that the EU is more than an international organization, right? It does things that international organizations cannot do, such as the direct application of law, and we'll get into that when we get into the legal function of the European Union, but it does fewer things than a state. It is not competent over all aspects of EU citizens' lives. We also have multi-level governance. And so the European Union doesn't just work as a singular entity giving orders to the member states. In many cases, it has shared competences with the member states, meaning that the member state can comment in one way and we can comment on another one. And there are situations where the EU has the power to make binding law. There are areas, however, where local jurisdictions, either member states or even regions within those member states, make laws. And of course, because only one branch of the branches of EU government is democratically elected, there is a serious question among Westerners about whether or not such an entity is legitimate.
Yeah, and the broader sort of rubric it falls under is what, you know, a lot of people in democratic governance would call informed consent. And I don't know, Richard, if you want to touch on that. If not, that's fine. But there's a broader sense of, you know, are we just do we have a bunch of pass-through entities for an extremely consolidated sort of you know, supranational structure? And that's I think a very fair question. I think it's been for quite a while, actually.
Yeah, I agree. All right. So in terms of the institutions, we've got several core institutions. And the first thing is that we have the European Council that's based in Brussels. And the European Council doesn't actually detail a lot about policy, but they are the ones who sort of set the framework about what's going to happen and when it happens. You then have two legislative bodies. You have the Council of the European Union, also called the Council of Ministers. And this council is the upper house of the legislature and is nominated by the state governments. So the government of Poland will send a minister there, and the government of Ireland will send a minister there. Then you have the European Parliament, which is one of the largest legislative bodies in the world with 751 members. And these are elected by the citizens of the European Union. You then have the European Commission, which is the executive. But it's worth pointing out that the European Commission, even though it's an executive, has the job of proposing the laws. The legislative branches do not propose their own laws. They vote on them, they amend them, they change them, but they do not have the ability to propose laws. And then once those laws pass through both legislative assemblies, they go back to the Commission for approval and implementation. Separate from this circle, from the executive to the legislative back to the executive, separate from that, we have the judiciary with the Court of Justice of the European Union, whose judges only review European Union law. And this is somewhat confusing to many European Union citizens. So if you have a court case under domestic law, such as, for example, you have a property dispute with somebody, and you are both in the same country, the Court of Justice of the European Union does not apply to your situation. You will go to the Supreme Court of your native country, and take the issue there. European Union courts are only involved if a European Union law is at question. So then we have the legal attributes of the European Union. And as we pointed out, when the Treaty of Lisbon was signed, the legal personhood and the pillar structure that had previously existed under the Treaty of Maastricht were inherited by the European Union. Prior to this, right, you had the three pillars, and the European community was the juridical person, the legal person. And so, for example, it was the European communities that had representation in the World Trade Organization. It was the European communities that would negotiate free trade treaties, right? Because without legal personhood, you can't enter into contracts. And the European Union took the legal personhood of the European communities and took all of its legal representation outside of the European Union, outside of Europe negotiations. And as I mentioned, the pillars were all merged, and the European Union objectives were set on promoting the rule of law, freedom and security, the internal market, the economic and monetary union, both of those under Article 3.3 and Article 3.4 being part of that further implementation of the Treaty of Rome, and the Union values and interests in the wider world, Articles 3.2 and 3.5 being something closer to the Copenhagen criteria and the Schengen Agreement, irrespectively. So one of the things that we pointed out is that the European Union has what's called direct applicability. So if I have actual international law, from like the UN or a similar international organization, what will happen is that I have my implementation instrument, be that the Security Council resolution or the General Council resolution, and then that goes before a national government to implement that as a treaty or something else. For example, if a treaty is signed by the US president, it is then sent before Congress for the process of ratification. And that act of ratification is what makes the treaty binding on American citizens. The European Union does not have this secondary framework. So as soon as the European Union passes a law, that law goes into effect in the member states with no act of ratification. This is very unique for any international organization, and is why the European Union is said to be supranational, right? It's beyond the nation state, but it is not an international organization. It has more powers than that. And in many cases, especially where the EU competency is exclusive, the EU law cannot even be challenged by national law, right? The national law doesn't have the ability or the scope to deal with it. And if there is an EU law on point, the national law cannot disagree with it, even if it's in an area of shared competency. So there's a process of how a European Union law is made, and if you want the whole song, you can go back to our previous episode. First of all, there's consultations and discussions between citizens, interest groups, and experts that go before the European Commission, and the European Commission makes a proposal. That proposal goes before the legislative groups for debate. Then once that it's approved and sent back to the Commission and the Commission approves it, national and local authorities implement the law. So even though the EU doesn't have its own police force, it does have the ability to compel the behavior of national police forces. And then any issues with the law are overseen by the Court of Justice. And so the European Union has basically two major types of laws. The first one we discussed was a regulation, and a regulation is on a very narrow issue usually, but once a regulation is passed, it goes into law effectively in the member states under the terms that it has. A regulation might be something like all wine bottles have a standard measurement of 750 milliliters, and that law will go into effect at the time stated in the regulation and be applicable in all member states without exclusion and without caveat. It is a very powerful tool, and so it's used only in it can be used legally in any situation, but it is generally used in cases where exact compliance is more necessary, like the size of a wine bottle, right? Because you're creating that common market, the ability to sell between multiple jurisdictions, you want to have some uniformity across the regions. You also have the directive, which is a more complicated piece of law. And a directive is binding, yes, but it's binding to the result, not to the actual words and statements in the directive. So it leaves a lot of levity to the national authorities to form and choose methods of implementation. For example, a directive may be the corporate tax rate has to be set between 15 and 25%. That gives all the member states a choice of whether they want to set it at 15, 16, 17, whatever, percent up to 25%. They can't set it higher, they can't set it lower than that band, but they can set it anywhere within that band. And directives can be addressed to specific member states. They don't have to apply to all the member states of the union. By default, they do. But if you address it to a specific member state or a specific set of member states, then only those member states are affected. There also becomes the issue of what's called transposition. When the directive is passed, the directive usually gives the member states time in their own legislatures to pass a law in concordance with the directive. And so that's called the period of transposition. Usually that period is about 2 years. There are some exceptions to that. And during that period of transposition, there have been a number about what are the EU member citizens' rights with respect to the European Union law when it hasn't yet been transposed. And generally speaking, the conclusion has been that transposition, before transposition, an EU member citizen does not have the right to rely on the directive in terms of what the law is, but they do have a right to rely on it in terms of what the law isn't, meaning that the member states cannot, in waiting for the transposition moment, do something like declare the corporate tax rate to be 40%, in order to that way when they have to make it 25% that they've recouped their loss, right? They can't do that kind of behavior. But at the same time, if the current corporate tax rate is 30% and the directive says 15 to 25%, they still have to pay that 30% until the national law is changed in accordance with the directive. But if the time has passed and transposition has not occurred, let's say it's 2.5 years, 3 years, and the transposition period is 2 years, and it hasn't been changed, the Court of Justice of the European Union can compel a state to begin deliberations on how to transpose the law immediately. And EU citizens can prevail in those kinds of cases. But yeah. So then we have the question of competencies, right? So you have exclusive competencies that the European Union has, shared competencies, and supplementary competencies that the member states have. And to really flesh it out, we have this, right? We have the exclusive, the shared, and the supporting competencies. And you can see which aspects the European Union has. When we're talking about a supporting competence, these are things that the member states do in their own lands, but the European Union can create sort of a facility where the nation states can discuss how to move forward together. Even though the European Union can't make
and a quick thing, Richard, if we can maybe spend a second or two, or a minute maybe here or two, just to sort of see how something like security, defense, foreign policy, et cetera, would be sort of intertwined and sort of put in gray zone areas and non-gray zone areas, because I think that's a very important thing that for people to try to understand, and really in some ways sort of the purpose of today's conversation.
Yeah, exactly. So security tends to be, right, we can see here that it tends to be a shared competence, right? The area of freedom, security, and justice, and common safety concerns as well. And that's because, right, member states do have the ability to control their own police and their own militaries and similar. And the European Union can act as a concert for that, right? That to create a facility for that discussion. But at the same time, the European Union does have its ability to make laws on questions of internal security based on that Schengen agreement that we've discussed. All right. So here we are. Are there any questions on sort of those fundamental aspects on either the history of the European Union, the organization of the European Union, or the legal implementation of laws under the European Union, before we move into today's discussion, which will be about common security, common foreign and security policy until 2015?
Yeah, let's see if we can get some questions in the chat, or things that people might be interested in covering. I think I know a lot of people would love to talk about Ukraine and turn everything into Ukraine, and eventually we will, in a future presentation, get into the challenges that the EU has and broader base Europe has with security. But the goal today is really setting that table so that everybody understands, when Europe or the EU tries to do something in concert with the states, where those limits are, or where that friction is between all their institutional prerogatives, basically.
Hey,
Because
Aaron,
they each have. Yep. Go ahead, please.
Sorry. I thought you were finished, Aaron. Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I just a quick comment on one of the slides before about voting for the European Parliament and such, and then the supremacy of European law over national law when in certain segments.
Mhm.
One of the problems is that the voting rate for European members of Parliament, I think, is something like 7% or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's a big notion among the European public that Brussels is distant, and that they don't have an effect on it, even though they do have the right to vote for all these things. And so
Right.
that there's kind of a deficit in terms of the legitimacy in the eyes of some Europeans, and that's what also helped breed resentment during Brexit. A lot of British would turn and say, "Well, Brussels is imposing all these horrible regulations on us, and we can't do anything about it." Well, that's not actually true, and it was really more on to a lack of interest and a lack of involvement. So
yeah, I would say that is probably 70-30. I would probably say 60. Depends on where you are in Europe, but somewhere between 50-50 and 70-30. But there is a extremely top-heavy, dominant approach to solving problems that does not. It might manifest itself because the UK is a big media market, so they can get a message out a million times more than Slovenians can. But if you have a challenge, like a pretty rational challenge to a lot of European sort of top-down policy action, I mean, you don't really have much recourse at the end of the day. It's just going to kind of run you over, and you can just at best sort of figure out how to delay it, or figure ways around it to your, the best proximity of your interest or of your people. It is really fundamentally a challenge, and you could see it's totally manifested in the Greek case, obviously.
The thing is that with most Europeans don't understand what it is that the European Union is doing on a day-to-day basis, and European Union leaders are absolutely horrible at communicating that to people.
Yeah, very true.
Absolutely.
So you have this problem, and secondarily, and it goes back to the fact that of the way the European Union is structured, the members in Parliament do not have the ability to create laws of their own, right?
Yep.
All the laws that come to them from the Commission. So there is no legal instrument that the European Union has passed that is based on the will of the parliament. And so none of the parliamentarians can go before the people and say, this is my objective. I will make sure that XXY directive is passed, and it will ensure your freedom and security by blah, blah, blah method.
Yeah, I mean, in some, oh, go ahead, Mark, sorry.
There's a name for that. It's called the democratic deficit.
Yeah, I mean, you could make a very fair argument at this point that the approach to EU governance at this stage, after literally more than half a century, is what you approach a failed state or a post-conflict state, and you're trying to sort of pull pieces together and drive a new generation of governance and stability, and sort of stand up your new future, which I would argue made complete sense until pretty much into the 70s. But after that, which is why I always fall back on my hobby horse of a European constitution, is that you really built a world for almost half a century now, where the common European citizens, not elites, not probably people like us that are nerds about things like this, or want to spend our time doing this, look at the concept of what Brussels is and what the EU is as in some ways sort of like an alien governance model. It's extremely devoid of your daily life, except where you see it sort of impose random standards, and sort of what looks like in some ways subjective enforcement. Even though most of the time it's not subjective, it can feel that way.
Right. And the question is, what's the value add, right?
That's right.
For a lot of people, they don't see whatever positives the European Union is doing, or they don't see those things as positives that outweigh the negatives. It's like, sure,
and it really boils down to, and I really do think this is the largest challenge the EU faces more medium term, is how to produce a traditional parliamentary structure, which people in Europe are used to, right? They have their own parliament, so they work at various levels of development, but at the end of the day, they have parliaments where they have committees and subcommittees and parties and shadow governments and so on, and people produce legislation that's relevant to their system, and people feel that, oh, okay, if whatever, we're having an a historical climate change driven event dealing with our olive production, then we're going to obviously try to do some intervention to support the olive farmers or the workers or everybody associated I'm using the olive, kind of example. And people don't feel that there's any way to do that, when it comes to the EU. So what they sort of do is have almost protest action at the dominant party in government in their state. And then that dominant party that's elected, whether it's a presidential or ministerial parliamentary system, they basically swing, to the right, to the center, to the up, to the down, whatever, and they take that sort of pet issue, and they basically, that's the hill they go die on. And in some ways, it's almost irrelevant if that issue is really that important. They have to respond because that protest is building. And you could argue the French did this with the Yellow Vest movement, with all of their mandates around change of pricing when it came to end user energy supplies, whether it was obviously petrol for diesel petrol for non-commercial automotives, but it was also commercial. And the real costs were dumped on top of the commercial side, which was really coming out of the EU. And the French basically responded logically at a political level. And so to me, that is really this gap that you have that is extremely unique in the world. I would almost argue it's becoming unique in the history of the world to have a system this big with this many people operating like this.
So let's move into what we'd like to discuss for today,
Yes,
and give it about an hour's worth of treatment, which is nowhere near
absolutely.
enough. So it'll flow into next month, but that's okay.
That's right.
So the common foreign security policy, international relations, of the European Union until 2015.
Yep.
All right, Aaron. So tell us what we're looking at here.
Sure. And please, everybody, jump in the chat if we haven't put you to sleep already. Which is, if we put you to sleep, that's okay too, because
Hey, we're
everyone
better
should be
than
taking
ASMR.
naps. If you're in Europe or in other parts of the world, you should be getting ready for bed or taking a nap. If you're in Europe right now before dinner, it's okay. If you're in the US, that's, get your afternoon nap. And go ahead, Mark.
Just as a quick thing, to go back on that funny Polish poster on the Polish plumber.
Yes.
What ended up happening?
That's a hit, by the way, after 4 presentations. I think
know
that
everybody
might be
notices the
big
Polish
thing.
plumber.
It was hilarious. But ironically, there weren't that many Poles that went to France. There were some, but a lot, and I don't know the absolute numbers, but a lot of Poles ended up in England.
Yes.
And doing all sorts of jobs, and there were Polish neighborhoods,
That's right.
just like there are Polish neighborhoods in Chicago, and they did the classic immigrant thing and working hard and building up wealth and sending their kids to school and all that kind of stuff. But some of that ended up feeding into the anti-immigrant notions of the Brexiters and the anti-European sentiments of the Brexiters, and helped push that movement a little bit, ironically, so to speak.
Yeah. No, and you bring up a good point there. The last one will, the last, not dead horse, but dead Polish plumber that we'll be beating here is the fact that very similar to this challenge that Europe has with these very de-invested industrial zones across multiple states. That's really a similar challenge the UK had in that de-investment. And you're seeing it in the UK. They have a thing called leveling up, which is basically their response to it, which I always argued that if the EU, if people could have gotten over their divorcing heuristics, right? The kind of battle phase of people divorcing, and just supported a leveling up process out of the EU, which would have been a special deal. I think Brexit would not have happened. And I also think there would have been this begrudging acceptance that the EU is listening. And there is a long-term 50, really 70, you're going back to de Gaulle in the late 50s, challenge between the UK and the EU and France, really, and it doesn't stop. And I think that's a real fundamental challenge long term. And I think when we talk about security today, it comes front and center right now, to be honest. So, all right. So enough of the Polish plumbers.
Yeah. One last question we have from Marika. She, it's a little complicated of a question to phrase, but we have this European Union entity.
No plumbers? No, I'm joking.
No plumbers. We have this European entity that has the legal power to dictate monetary policy, marine conservation, shared competency on transport and trans-European networks. And you have this sort of system, and it seems like you've got these circus directors trying to get lions to jump through hoops. And
yep.
How does this organization work in the sense of like actually achieve the objectives that it's stated to achieve? And I think that's a great question.
Yeah. And no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Aaron.
No, I mean, number one, Marika's like usual, extremely accurate and saved 45 minutes of a discussion here with her question. And it's probably the answer that, you would assume, Marika, which is that it does it like anyone else in that type of circus environment. It just keeps plodding forward. And if there is a broad take on the EU that I would always want someone to understand is
too desired to fail.
Exactly. And there is almost a certain, the old Churchill quote about the United States, it's basically, when we've tried everything else and it hasn't worked, you can count on us getting it done in our last attempt, basically. The EU has a version of that, which I argue is the same, basically. It's that they're on this, I would say, destiny mission. And it's one direction, it's all in. How much the all in is on any given day is random. right? So people could be 48% all in on a day or 100%, and it sort of fluctuates. But it is ultimately going into that direction. Now, you might argue, what direction is that? And I would say, I don't know. It's some sort of supranational direction, basically.
Yeah, I would say that you've created this sort of, if we go back to the 19th century with the concert of Europe, right? And in the post Napoleonic era, you had European leaders coming together to try and create peace. And you had this sort of connectivity across Europe in order to facilitate that, which really broke down in World War One.
That's right.
But this sort of idea of European educated bureaucrats who all generally have the same sort of social outlook, who have the same sort of economic perspective, sitting in a room saying, yeah, these great university theories that we heard, they seem to make perfect sense on paper. Let's try to implement them.
That's right.
And you could almost call that like a Eurocrat, right? Like this sort of way of ruling. And that tends to be the driving force behind how this mechanism works, that you have so many of these well-educated, well-meaning individuals going over and creating these large-scale policies that, of course, when they get down to the local level, have a lot of fits and starts. And then every time that they fail, they go back to the drawing board and they're like, okay, what were the 5 things that we missed last time when we were designing this policy? And they keep doing that.
And unless there is a, let's say, cataclysmic event, they do not reach outward. So in the business or in the public sector world around the world, people like to use phrases like customer journey or customer experience. There's not a very strong customer experience or citizen experience, right? If it's public sector. That's in that feedback loop, unless there's a cataclysmic sort of event or a mini cataclysmic event, which let's call a mini one, the Yellow Vest movement in France, or things like that. And a cataclysmic maybe Ukraine, Russia. And so until you have things like that, they don't sort of debate these things. And then, of course, they swing all the way to the other side, right? So there is a almost schizophrenic dimension to this, which I do think really fundamentally boils down to the legislative design model. I really think you should be able in the modern world to have digital legislature like this, very, very virtual, at the Brussels level. And then people can stay in their home host countries and basically do, what, at least in the United States and in other countries like the Philippines, whatever, you have your local, state, and, sort of national or federal legislator. And they go to the Capitol 1 week a year, or a month, or every 6 weeks or whatever. But the rest of the time they're pressing the flesh and figuring out, oh, wow, okay, you have a corn logistics problem because of XYZ happened, and, like that type of stuff. And there just isn't any of that. I mean, they have all kinds of weird seminars basically every like 3 months between people from the same country, which, how awkward must that be? Right? Like, I'm going to come to an event while you represent us there, and I'm going to explain to you in this very formal kind of, PowerPointy framework, our little problem, because it needs to fit into this, template, and, and then it disappears. And of course, that's a very, I would argue that is a very legitimacy destroying approach. Because at the end of the day, when someone gets pushed at a legislative level, right, left, up, down, it doesn't matter. What are they going to say? They have to say the truth, which, well, I went to the thing every quarter and told her or him, and then people know who those names are. And when that person tries to come back and run for mayor, I mean, you see it all the time in Europe. They get blasted. Like, what did you do in Europe for 4 years besides, put your kids in great school and get another master's and set yourself up for the next job? And that's cynical, because they did do things, but people just don't view it because you didn't fix this. How come this road is broken?
Right.
Anyway,
and so,
Aaron, anyways,
let's take a look at this.
Let's pivot.
So
that's right.
If I'm looking at this graph, and perhaps you can shine a little light on it,
exactly.
It seems like almost every major aspect of economic, social, legal, and international policy that was previously at the national level in 1950, prior to the ECSC, is now suddenly basically an EU dominated competence. Can you sort of
That's
go
right.
over that?
Yeah. So I did this up to Lisbon, and then and then there's a bunch of sort of, let's call it, tapas plates put on top of Lisbon in the last decade, which we'll cover in the next presentation. But so as you can see, we went from a world that was these were just states, to a world where a pretty substantial chunk of policy that the EU has shifted to is in play. And when you look at economic policy, you look at what's interesting about things like social industrial policy is there's a big gray zone there, and it's pretty untransparent, right? Because France will get a carve out, Germany will get a carve out, Netherlands will get a carve out. There's these oddball carve outs because one of the policies from the beginning, when it comes to the modern EU, really Maastricht and on forward the last 30 years, has been to have this sort of multi-track or multi-stage EU ascension process. So you can participate in some aspects of what used to be called pillars and other aspects, basically as long as you had a 5, 10, 20-year plan to sort of jump on board. But there were so many of these that at a certain point, who was paying attention? I mean, obviously somebody writing papers were, but I'm saying within the political sphere. And then when it came to things like international relations and security, and I would argue there's a trust deficit, right? Because when you see things like economic policy all over the place, social industrial, things like legal constitutional just really, really become difficult to move for obvious reasons. And then by the time you get to things that are international security, defense, a lot of states either are piggybacking on other states' policies. So there's a concept, in economics, basically they're freeloading, or they're just setting their own policy, like a France.
When you're talking about this freeloading, are you talking about things like, for example, how France has the largest army in Europe, and so countries like Belgium will just adopt French foreign policy because they can count on French military? Or
and what I would argue is they adopt French military foreign policy, but when it comes to any economic or any kind of cohesion, right? We all talked about the cohesion funding processes. So things like humanitarian aid. So what goes on a lot, and it's not irrational, right? So if I can benefit as a state to get credit for having a fantastic humanitarian program, I'm not going to wait for another state and share that, right? I'm going to jump out in front and do it. Now, and especially a place like Belgium, so there's a lot of what's called policy arbitrage, or policy entrepreneurship is sort of the more, let's say, aggressive version of it, maybe. I don't know, maybe the other way around. And so a place like Belgium is a great example because they're a lot smaller, they're niftier. They hear, obviously, their ears are to the ground in Brussels, so they kind of know where things are going directionally, like very real time. So they can jump way out in front. And the French are a big state, just like any other big state, not just in Europe, but anywhere. And it might take 6 or 12 months. And then basically, Belgium's gotten all the sweet benefits in media and in sort of, cutting edge policy. The Dutch do the same thing. The Netherlands does the same thing vis-a-vis Germany often. So you have this very funky dynamic between these states. Portugal is a fantastic example of this. They're probably the best in maybe the world at this. They go way out in front. Because they know where it's going. And so maybe everyone else catches up 2-3 years later. And, they've taken all the photo ops, they've gotten all the benefits of it. And they've done good too. I'm not suggesting they don't, but let's not kid ourselves and say there's not a real sort of political benefit here. So to jump sort of in the European defense community. So obviously after, the scale of destruction and the the development of the Cold War, the reconstruction of some form of state security that was not as, let's say, imperial or violent, was critical after World War II. And to be honest, the United States, having poured an enormous amount of resources through the Marshall Plan and wanted to assist these countries in at least having what you would call conventional defense, meaning very much of what you see like Ukraine doing, right? So territorial defense became very important to the United States for obvious practical reasons, right? Because unless you were willing to move 5 million Americans over to Europe and have them live there forever, which I don't think would have been a great idea. I mean, maybe I wouldn't have minded it for my personal selfish self growing up or something, but at a practical level, that it was just never going to be practical. You needed Europeans to have skin in the game. And so, there was also some fundamental challenges, which was, what is Germany? Right? What is this thing called Germany? Which at that point was only West Germany. We have to forget that 1/3 of Germany was in the Warsaw Pact, or what became the Warsaw Pact by the mid-50s, but basically under Soviet control. So this let's just say governed West Germany, right? Which the post-Allies, basically, which were France, UK, and the US on the Western Germany side, and wanted to maintain a much more defensive, and if in some ways almost pacifist Germany, very much like Japan, and the Germans did too, really, for that matter. So there was a substantial French opposition for obvious reasons, having fought 3 substantial wars going back to the 1870s, against Germany, and let's just say not doing fantastic in all 3 of those. That the French really under the Fouchet Plan basically said, all right, well, let's just, if we could suck in the German, economic, what we knew was going to be industrial and economic growth, plus their conscripts into a French-led, European defense community, that might be okay. And ultimately, that's what the sort of godfather of all of this is the Fouchet Plan. And then the goal in this was to create a common army. So this was obviously too extreme to create a common sort of. There's been a discussion for over 100 plus years, sort of theoretical circles, of sort of merging France and Germany together, which always sounds very weird, except to people who really love this. It's sort of like let's merge USMCA countries together and call ourselves the United North American States, right? I mean, it's
the value of a crossover TV show, right?
That's exactly what it is. It's if you look at all good TV shows, it's the Breaking Bad and Saul's, if you're into that, or a bunch of others. But so obviously creating the full European army never made any sense, or a common integrated one between the French and the Germans. But the concepts behind some form of European collective security stuck. If you don't mind going to and also you had the construction of NATO in 48, 49, 50, which was really fundamental, actually. Because
if NATO existed in 47, 48, why was there still movement towards this Fouchet Plan in the early 1950s? Wouldn't that have sort of fallen under the NATO umbrella?
So this goes back to the fundamental, as you know, the challenge between France and NATO, and especially under general, eventually, president, prime minister, et cetera, de Gaulle, where the French independence, militarily and strategically, was very fundamental, very much like the United States. It's really the same, actually, and I would say like the UK. And so there was always this friction, which the French, which eventually blew up in the French, not being in NATO, and then eventually coming back into NATO. But I would argue their commitment to NATO is the equivalent of the UK's commitment to the EU. That has been something I've said for quite a while. which is, yeah, they're there, they're selling, they're part of it ish at various stages, but there's not all-in commitment. And the French will never have all-in commitment in NATO. It goes against sort of their fundamental identity. And so the U.S. really developed NATO, and to this day, I argue, all NATO is the United States combat power blended with variant combat power that can be attained from either Turkey, UK, or France, and a little bit with Italy, because none of them have the transport capability. So, there's sort of three things to think about in security. You have a territorial defense, which is something you do in your homeland. That's one. That's obvious. You have to have that, or else you can't protect yourself. And then you have to develop either combat power and or combat support power, right? Which would be, all the support and logistics, what's called the tooth to tail, right? The other, for every person that is actually part of combat power, a pilot, someone in the infantry and armor, et cetera, there's 5 to 10 other people, sometimes 15 other people supporting them. So that whole support infrastructure. And so in Europe, almost every country has only at best that support infrastructure. And because it's really not integrated, except when they do exercises, NATO exercises, which are, they're ongoing. There's a big one going on right now, actually, in Northern Europe, about 30,000. I don't think it gets much coverage, but except for that, there just isn't really much co-development. And so you don't have expeditionary capability. And so the US is the only one that brings any substantial, or that brings the expeditionary capability. And so that's something to be very, very aware of when you're getting down to that knife's edge in something that could actually be military driven versus foreign policy, international relations, broader security policy, which can include humanitarian, climate change, regional development, et cetera, right? Obviously, Europe has what I would say very near superpower status when it comes to all of the other aspects of collective security, but versus the sort of kinetic aspects of collective security, right? I would say you want to separate that. Any other questions at this point? You can monitor the questions.
Yeah, Mark, you had a comment. Would you like to add that?
Yeah. Simply, there was a British general at the time who quipped that the only thing that European armies have in common is the air in their tires.
Yep, that's an old saying. Absolutely.
And
so let's talk about the Western European Union.
Yep. Yeah. So what's really important here is, and this is something that's lost, I think, and especially through Brexit and Johnson, Trump, blah, 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 the modern social media world and all the narcissism. We don't have to go down that rat hole, but is that really the UK has been arguably the preeminent driver to Western European integration into a security system, not just through NATO, but through its own cooperation, like on the ground. And that has never, there's really no other state like them in Europe. And I would say in some ways, even more than the United States, because they're just there, right? They're physically there. I'm not saying the US isn't physically there. Obviously, people are assigned or rotated, but it's just different. It's just different when you get into the daily living versus just being rotated through. And so the UK, even back then, 70 years under Churchill, this is Churchill, I think understood fundamentally that if you don't, it's almost like the EU of today of security was his vision. Is that if you don't integrate, and of course, the real question there is, do you integrate your military? Because that's like the final blocking, the final Lego block. And his view, and many others in the UK, was we start there. We start at that building block, because once you start there, everything else, flows off.
Falls into place.
It falls into place. And to be honest, Europe, in very much like the constitutional question we were talking about earlier in the system, this is the problem, right? They didn't follow this path, and it was always discussed as sort of the British option. And I think what most people didn't fully appreciate is while the Brits wanted to maintain a sort of, let's say a leadership role in this for obvious reasons, and also just practical and ego reasons, their larger aim was not sort of UK first. It really was about building a common Western European security infrastructure so that you never ever have wars, because everybody is going to be so commingled, right? You'll have Italian, tank repair, men or people now that would be in a tank regiment that's led by a British colonel that is in France, right? It's just that who's fighting who at that point, right? You couldn't. Unless you form mafias or something, right? But
no, I mean, you'd have the Lebanon problem, right? Yeah, like
exactly.
If something really deteriorated to the point where the nations all went to their separate sides, you'd have just massive raiding on the barracks, and
that's exactly right.
That's right. It would go down like the Lebanese Civil War, but that would be unthinkable in Europe.
Yeah, that would have been unthinkable at scale, right? Everywhere across all the states, and there would be state apparatuses to basically block people, right? I mean, and or make it very, very difficult, create a lot of friction. So that was the vision, and I would say, to be honest, that is a vision still missing. And sadly, I think that is the worst part of Brexit. I've always felt is not the economics, which everyone has been sort of focused on. I get for 5, 7 years, 10 years, whatever. Now, it's the loss of the UK as a prima facie leader at the security table.
That's very true.
You see it in the Ukraine problem right now, because a Britain, UK in the EU right now, there's no question, is taking a substantial center stage, in the Commission right now when it comes to security policy, and helping other states get as much expeditionary capacity as they could muster, which is a lot more than they do right now, which right now that falls basically completely on the United States right now.
Yeah.
And that's a fundamental problem. And that's not sustainable, because the US ultimately is sort of doing we're not talking about it right now, but it's basically, we're doing a cheating Lend-Lease right now. Right.
Yeah,
if you remember Lend-Lease, what we're doing, but that's going to run out once you hit a budget number at a certain point, which it always does. And then someone's got to bring this up, because we have a representative democracy, no matter what people actually say. But and eventually you got to vote on some real money here. So anyway,
that we've talked about sort of excluding Britain from the European Union, I think it's actually a really good time to talk about the Fouchet Plan and how the French sort of imagine keeping Britain out.
Yeah, exactly. And what you constantly see here, and I love France, and I love French TV a lot, actually. But one thing you see in the French security approach to Europe is they're relitigating, half a millennia of fighting the Brits, basically. And they do it through modern policy action. And there's a real fundamental challenge, and you see it today, and we'll get into this, the Fouchet Plan right now, but they're holding up some really important security sharing with the UK right now, military wise, like real stuff, because of this phishing, blah, 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 garbage going on, which just is so fourth tier given the challenges we have. But there is that ingrained sort of two twin brothers, and who is the best one, and they're fighting it out regardless of the cost of the family. So in the 60s, de Gaulle introduced the Fouchet Plan, which established a political structure for EC states, or European community states, that would be dominated by national governments instead of supranational. So this is think of it as the French hedge on security. And it excluded Britain, and it was rejected by the Netherlands and Belgium, because obviously they had some experience between Germany and France over a few hundred years, treating them like a highway system that they ran back and forth over. And it's something actually missed often, is that there is a very and some of it goes back, in the UK for 300-400 years, obviously with the Dutch, but there's a very strong relationship at a security level between when I say Belgium, I mean domestic Belgium, not EU, but domestic Belgium, and the Netherlands and the UK. And in some ways, that's actually accelerating right now. There's a real big debate in Belgium right now, which is, while we're in the EU and France is EU and NATO and blah blah blah, when we want to start pivoting to do things in Ukraine, who are we going to piggyback on top? And they're piggybacking on top literally with the UK. I mean, they're literally flying, like physically, with the UK over to Poland and so on. So I think a big thing to recognize is that this is something the French have always held out. This is sort of like their internal to the EU UN Security Council veto, right? So if you think of UN Security Council vetoes, and which maligned or benign actors might do at various stages, the French are like that type of actor when it comes to the EU and national defense and security. And I would say their fundamental objective has been, since the end of World War II, to prevent England, UK, Britain, whatever, from having a substantial role, not even the dominant, but a substantial role in defining Western European security. And I would say that is as large, and in some ways larger, than many aspects of the Cold War, at least for French policy. Any questions you guys have? And then, by the way, you can switch slides here. Sorry. And there's questions, you guys can just holler them out. All right. So there was a structure that was developed called the European Political Cooperation, EPC, which I think you covered, Richard, a couple of presentations back, or at least talked about a little bit, which was in the Hague Summit of '69, which drove deeper integration. So the EPC allowed coordination amongst member states, and as I think, hopefully, you're gaining this appreciation that when the EU tackles something, it's almost like a snake. They rarely go in for the bite, right? They kind of only save that for the end, right? It's this large encirclement, and then or like an onion, right? They peel the onion, and it's this process of peeling the onion, which might take a few years or decades, right? And so in the Luxembourg 70 report and the Copenhagen report in 73, it's put the 4 levels of political cooperation among states, between the heads of states, meeting of foreign ministers, the political committee, and the working groups. That is sort of what you almost want to call the primordial European Union political governance structure, right? Almost like the way we think of the founding fathers in the United States or in other countries having their independence from whatever colonial power at various stages. They had that founding union. This is sort of their version of it at the EU supranational level. The reason this is important, if you go to the next slide here. So then what this did is think of it as the creation of, go back one real quick, just for a second there. Okay, yeah, great, thanks. Just this one here. So this developed this intergovernmental character, or this method of being highly internalized, so that everything was done between heads of governments and states and their sort of policy and professional technocratic staffs. But of course, the problem is with something like this is that same character prevents any type of response to a crisis of any magnitude. And you could argue a very similar crisis of today, Russian invasion of Ukraine, is the Soviet back then invasion of Afghanistan. And so the EPC was just, landlocked on itself, and couldn't get out of neutral. And in 79. And so what they did, which is another attribute to the European Union and the European policy development process for 70 years, is when they get stuck somewhere, they rarely say we're punching through this. They say, okay, stop. We'll form committees, research reports, study it, blah blah blah. That'll be fight for another day. Now we're going to go do something else. And this something else was this shift to foreign policy versus hard security and defense, which basically were handled by NATO, right? And if you think of NATO in the 70s and 80s, it was extremely strong as a structure. I mean, even with all of the resistance by France, which there was quite a bit, there was just a unique character. And a lot of that came down to the commitment of West Germany and the other European states that had, I think, experienced some degree of either Soviet communist political action, or of the risk of being on that front line in the Cold War. And so they had a much stronger commitment to NATO then than they do obviously today. And so this is sort of the character of how the defense sort of evolved out. And then if you go to the next slide real quick. All right, thanks. So you have this sort of need, let's say, because of the post Afghan invasion crisis. And by the way, that wasn't the only crisis in 1979, right? You had obviously the revolution in Iran. I mean, so you had Saudi Arabia had their challenges. You obviously had a new peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, which sort of knocked a bunch of table pieces around. I mean, so you had a lot of change. Obviously, Lebanon, had really started to substantially deteriorate, and so the whole Middle East, obviously, and you had a whole new engagement in China that was just brand new, to the world, and a much more intensive phase of the Cold War was kicking in, right? I think a lot of people don't fully realize that the Reagan military buildup actually started in 78 and in 79 under Carter. We can't forget he was a Rickover Navy nuclear submariner. So, he obviously supported a pretty robust nuclear triad-based submarine force, which, if anybody knows, submarines are pretty close to the most expensive thing we've ever built consistently in the world, right up there with aircraft carriers. And so, we started that big spend period, and there was a big amplification on both the Soviet and the US side, and ultimately the European side. And so by the mid to late 80s, there was the French Mitterrand really started to recognize, and eventually to Chirac, that, okay, France needs to come up with a more modern, I would put it, and maybe mature approach to European security integration and NATO. And then and I think this is really important, once the Cold War ended and you sort of had all the die thrown in the air, and NATO was not going to go away, then that offered the French a, let's say, do-over or a reset period. And I think this is something very important to recognize, is that that's when France really, let's say, went from 25, fluctuating always between 25 and 50% committed to NATO, to 50 to 75% committed to NATO, which still seems pretty uncommitted, but for the French, that was pretty darn committed. And I would say for NATO, that was important, actually, into the 90s. And so that really started this process of a new security model, which is going on 30 years now, really. And there's always been this friction, basically, which is the Western European Union, right, the WEU, right, that we talked about sort of earlier, or what was mentioned earlier in the slide. The question is, how much independence does Europe want to have, does the Western European states and powers want to have from the United States when it comes to collective security, when it comes to military, comes to... Now, a big chunk of this, and we can't lose sight of it, is a whole bunch of European defense contractors and their benefits, or US contractors and our benefits and their benefits too, because you can drive around a lot of states in the United States, and I guarantee you can find a minimum of 10, if not in some cases 100 European defense contractors in states in the United States. And you could go to, at least a dozen to 24 European countries, and you'll find US defense contractors there too. So it's a question of sort of political credit that you get for it, because you get more credit if you're a Washington state legislator and you brought more jobs to Boeing than if you're an Italian Tuscan legislator and you brought more jobs to Boeing, even if there's a Boeing plant right down the street. It's just, you'd rather say we got jobs for, Bombardier or whatever. So anyways, this shift, which is really the same place they're in now, which is, do we have a European army? Do we have our own separate security policy? And how do we keep that separate from NATO? And of course, like everything the Europeans do, they split the baby and kept splitting it. So you have a NATO structure that's within states, and then you have a NATO cooperation agreements, basically, between the EU and its security policy and defense policy structures. And then there is this sort of independent policy by the individual states. And to be honest, then you have this sort of broken clearinghouse between them. And anytime there's a crisis, a migrant crisis going across the Mediterranean, right? You can't afford to have 4 months of counselor meetings, right? Somebody's Coast Guard within 6 to 24 hours has to get moving. And when that Coast Guard gets moving, someone else's cooperation agreement has to help step in, because that state still has human beings that go in the ocean near, and they need support. And that whole process is the real fundamental challenge that you have within Europe, and we'll get into that. So that's the kind of Cold War. And then the Gulf War, we go to the next slide. And check if there's any questions or comments, because I want to make sure
there are none.
Okay.
Marika left one comment, which is that Reagan expanded the military industrial complex significantly more than even Carter did.
Oh, I didn't say he didn't, but this idea that, we had a defense industrial complex of, Denmark in the late 70s, and it was cute, and then somehow, we exploded that 100x 3 years later, is just not true. I mean, it basically, the Carter buildup, which started in 78, was a substantially aggressive buildup, and I'm not judging it. I'm just pointing it out. Like, these are just, you can look at the budget figures, and especially in the large programs, the expensive programs, and then the Reagan era extended those and added theirs on, all the way through to the end of the Cold War, into the Gulf crisis. So at the outbreak of the Gulf crisis, there was and also to set the table a little bit, a lot of people don't fully realize, and Mark, you can jump in too here, that France had a very strong relationship with Iraq. going back for a few decades. And that relationship was very strong in terms of military cooperation as a defense contractor. They were basically the primary outside defense contractor for Iraq. And the U.S. and Brits provided some small percentages, between 5 and 20% at various stages, but the French were the dominant contractor. And so there was a lot of jobs, a lot of French jobs. And so when the Gulf crisis came, there was this big argument around, well, what's the common European foreign policy with defense? And how do you square that with, what has to get done on the ground, which was to provide for collective defense for the rest of the Gulf at that point, and to eject Iraq from Kuwait. And so what basically happened is the UK supported not just the US, but what you would say, and I don't think a lot of people, because we're so essentialist and we like these very simplistic narratives, fully realizes the uniqueness of the Gulf War, in that the Russians at that point supported, or the Soviet/Russians, as that sort of occurred, or that dissolution occurred, supported the resolutions against Iraq. And in some ways, that was the big missing signal that Saddam had to change course at a policy level. Because once it became pretty clear that in essence the Russians slash Soviets were on board with at least not supporting what Saddam did in invading Kuwait, and much less tacit support for Desert Shield, Desert Storm, pretty much the jig was up, right? Because then you had a United Nations-like force of dozens of different states, of which the French were one of. But the French had a unique kind of approach. They leveraged, they kind of did this Jedi two-front war at a security, foreign, and defense policy. They directly contributed several a pretty substantial military mission, tens of thousands, but at the same time maintain a separate unilateral policy, because they felt they could change Iraqi behavior given the scale of the relationship they had. And of course, they didn't fully recognize, I think, either, that this had become a big state actor type event, that if Iraq wasn't responding to both what the Russians and the United States were doing, much less the other collected security components of the Gulf defense, then they weren't going to listen to the French either. But it was something they did. Now Germany did something very unique then, and versus Spain. So Spain actually, this became an opportunity for the Spanish to, in some ways, let's say, start the process to rebrand as a positive actor, and move on from the sort of Franco era, and I would say also to modernize their defense, and in some ways really incorporate themselves fully into NATO.
I was going to say, if I could push a little bit on that,
sure.
Why would you say that Spain didn't have that image as a positive actor, given the fact that Spain had historically been part of NATO, had always been on the US side during the Cold War, and had been part of negotiations, whether they were directly part of the French, German, British situation, but they weren't, for example, an adjutant.
No, that's completely correct. I mean, what I would say is the Spanish could have sat back as a free rider in the Gulf, and I don't think anyone would have missed them. I don't mean that as an insult either. I just mean at a practical level. They made a conscious choice to, I would almost say, split the UN and NATO, baby, is what they did basically, where they went in as a positive NATO actor and also supporting the UN resolutions. In some ways, like you see, which is, we're not used to this when we see this, that there's really sort of two Pakistani foreign policies. There's a very pro-UN very pro peacekeeping, very, it's like, it's one of the ways they project, I would say, very positive power in the world. And then there's the local, regional, kind of dimensions, which is a different animal. And I think what the Spanish did is recognize they could get a lot of soft and hard power benefits. And also don't underestimate modernizing themselves in the post-Cold War era, which was going to be a new world. And one of the benefits at a military development and industries perspective is working alongside the US and UK, exposed them to a lot of areas that they brought domestically back. And to this day, they are I'd say they and the Dutch, the Germans, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the Spanish are probably the most efficient developers of hardware in the world, especially organic hardware, things they build from scratch, not taking other designs that they sort of retrofit, and a lot of that goes back to the Gulf. I mean, so they were able to bring things back, or bring lessons, ideas, approaches, partnerships, etc. And what you would call, like, and if you're familiar with the United States, and you have these shops in Europe too, it's sort of the TJ Maxx model, right? Where you get a lot of first tier, all second tier plus goods at a pretty good discount. And
Mark,
that's what the Spanish did. So
yeah, Mark, you had a couple comments about the Franco-Iraqi relationship. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, briefly, sure. When the Iran-Iraq war started, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran to trying to take advantage of the chaos after the revolution and the killing a lot of competent Iranian military officers, then went bad. Iran was more powerful of a country, and then the Iraqis were on the back foot, and Western countries were afraid that Iraq would just that Iran would overrun Iraq, and then decide to go all the way to Saudi Arabia, which was the old fear. And so what they saw Iraq collectively as a bulwark against Iranian military success. And so the West kind of got together and said, okay, we'll do this, you do that, And one of the things the French did was they deepened their relationship with the Iraqis, business and technology. They are the ones who, if I remember correctly, they're the ones who built that nuclear power plant in Baghdad that also had medical facilities that the Israelis bombed.
Yeah, also Iraq.
Yeah, thank you. And the French sold the Iraqis a lot of high-end military equipment like Mirage, and I'm not sure what else, but there were a lot of things. And so the French were making a lot of money. They had good relationships with the Iraqis, and then all of a sudden the invasion of Kuwait happened, and the French were like, "Wait a minute, we've got a good thing going here. Let's not overreact." So it took them a while, but they eventually did get into the game, and they sent some important military units for the left wing of the Allied attack into Iraq. So
if I could push you a little further, what really facilitated the Franco-Iraqi relationship when Iraq could theoretically pose a security threat to other NATO members? What was sort of the thought process that led to the facilitation of that relationship? Was it just security concerns, or were there also cultural connections?
I remember it was just in a fear of Iran sort of thing, and the French also had a rather they started pro-Israeli early on, and then they went pro-Arab, particularly after the 73 oil crisis. And so and French, for some reason, like to think of themselves as a mover and shaker and influencer in the Arab world. And so this was part of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because all the great stuff that happened in the colonial period there under the French. I'm joking. That was sorry.
Yeah. It never seemed terribly rational to me, but it is.
Yeah.
No, but
look. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, with regards to the Middle East, whichever one wasn't the colonizer was usually the one that was favorably viewed between the British and the French. So you have a lot. So you have a lot of pro-French stuff coming out of Egypt. You have a lot of pro-French stuff coming out of Iraq. You have a lot of pro-British stuff coming out of Lebanon. You have a lot of pro-British stuff coming out of Tunisia. It's just it's always like the one that invaded is the horrible, evil one, but the one that stays outside, oh, that that one has our heart.
Yeah, and
Very
I would
funny.
also say that I think a lot, because they would be often on the opposite sides, there would be this sort of belief that in these independent Middle Eastern states that there would be some sort of accretive benefit because I can, sort of pump the Brits or the French for information on my enemy, or my enemy's my friend type of stuff. And so anyways, to finish up on this, so one thing that's really important here is to understand that every state in the EU has various constitutional policies, legal structures and frameworks around what they can and can't do when it comes to their engagement abroad, especially when it comes to force or the potential for force. And so the Germans have a constitutional ban on sending troops outside of NATO's defined area. Oh, go back one real quick. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the end of it, which actually applies to today, right? Which has no media at all. Nobody's covering this, right? The Germans can't send people to Ukraine. I mean, they could, but then obviously someone in some party is going to sue, and away we go. Yeah, so anyways, and then Ireland has obviously always been a extremely neutral party, and it's very, Ireland's its own funky thing when it comes to international relations, soft power versus hard power, relative to their own approach to governance, right? So in essence, Ireland is in essence a pacified military state. They really don't have a military in that conventional sense. That's independent of what they might have internally, security and police and so on. And so they have an extremely advanced commitment to international organizations, humanitarian aid. I mean, there might not be anyone in the world quite like Ireland like this. I mean, they are.
I was going to say, could you drill a little bit more in depth into that and sort of clarify? Is that they don't have a national army? Is that army doesn't deploy? Like, what does that mean?
Oh no, they have almost no national army. They have a handful of Coast Guard. We're talking rescue driven, right? Because obviously it's an island and there are people who need rescuing. So there's a whole world around that, but when it comes to sort of, they don't have, there isn't an Irish Air Force loaded up with F-15s, right? There isn't a expeditionary Irish Marines. There isn't any of that, right? But on the flip side, when you look at their international NGO and state directly sponsored people in their, ministry of across all their ministries, really, they have an extremely advanced commitment to international organizations, NGOs, UN organizations, variant humanitarian and conflict, management organizations. They just have always drawn the line, and not just militarily, but at a foreign policy level. It's sort of like almost a hyper Switzerland in certain respects.
If I could also push in a little bit of a different direction here. During the 1970s and 1980s, you had the Troubles. How did that issue relate to Western European security? And because we've talked about some of the plans to either exclude Britain or include Britain. Yeah, can you sort of talk?
Well, I mean, you could make an argument. This goes further back, all the way to the early 20th century and the conflicts that Irish have had with Britain, with Great Britain, and including during World War II. I mean, most people don't realize that Ireland was basically neutral during World War II. So they've always it's almost a more extreme version of the French British conflict around power and around, who do I care more about their defeat than I care more about, because that's critical for my needs, right? Which obviously, for Irish independence and for the ability to not have any British influence, that became paramount above really any. You could make an argument really about almost anything in the 20th century, right? So there's this sort of strange reality that the Irish have been in this parallel world in the last 100+ years, gaining, basically their independence, and not participating, or being able to sort of not have to participate in a lot of the conflictual things of the last 100+ years. In many ways, a big part of World War I too, because there was a lot of trust issues and so on. And so, you did have Irish regiments. There were forces. So I'm not suggesting it didn't exist.
That's because Ireland wasn't independent in World War
That's
I.
right.
Ireland was part
That's
of the
exactly right. That's exactly. But even then, proportionally, it was very small. And so that's sort of unique about Ireland. And Germany, funky way, has its own sort of micro Irish policy in some ways. So there's this large divide, and I know we're running up against time, so we'll cover this, which will kind of set us up for the next time. So there's you want to think of it as sort of inside the elite world of people who believe they're European first, or there are an Atlanticist, which is somebody that believes in, ultimately means you believe in NATO. You believe in a cross US / which includes also, people forget Canada's in NATO, also includes basically North America, but the US, of course, preeminently, and European security approach versus a European independent approach. And this has been ongoing for 70 years, right? And will probably be for 70 more years. And so there's a divide, right? So the UK, Netherlands, Portugal have always been 2 feet in, 100%, NATO to the end. And they've always either not or sought to see, substantially weaken any kind of policy initiative that changed the character of the Atlantic Alliance. And then on the Europeanist side, which of course is dominated by the French, which is very funky because the Germans sort of ignore it. So the French will go way out on the limb, and the Germans will just lose the invite to the party. And then, whatever the French say we're doing, the Germans will be like, huh? Oh, is that what you guys talked about? Oh, I missed that. Can you send me the paper? Oh, I'm on vacation. Oh, And so the Germans have played this, they're sort of like that middle brother sister that has to stop the twins from fighting, right? And they sort of play that tweener role. And then everybody else sort of falls into their either national interests / what they can either freeload and or where they see the security risks going, right? So if there's a large shift to security, like a great example we'll talk about in a future presentation, which really shaped the security policy in Europe the last 20 years, is terrorism. I mean, just to be honest, to a far greater degree than the United States. I know that sounds crazy.
No,
because the scale
impacted Schengen substantially.
Exactly. And also, to be honest, while the United States had 9/11 and there were some smaller incidents after 9/11, Europe had multiple big city incidents, which I argue radically changed the shape of the character in their security, primarily because all the elites live in the big cities more often than not, or a lot of the big cities. And so that built sort of a feedback loop, and we'll get into that later, right? But I think that's one thing that in some ways Europe was, you could argue, more aggressive than the United States. And I know that sounds crazy because of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so you could make a distinction between the United States at an expeditionary level abroad versus domestically. And because the domestic character in Europe is radically changed because of terrorism and the inter-security cooperation around that. So, and what's very fascinating, because it speaks to, I think, existential, at least political, and in some cases, obviously physical risk, the cooperation between England or the UK and the French, let's say the most advanced special intelligence and special operations community, is seamless. It's absolutely seamless. And so the thing is, they can't build on it because it's secretive. It's as secret as it gets, right? So there's this very tight bond inside those communities around anti-terrorism, counterterrorism, and so on.
All right.
Any other
final
questions
before we give final announcements?
Yep.
All right. Just send in the questions while I'm doing the announcements then. I've just put on the calendar for all three groups, History Mostly Ancient, New York Culture, and London Culture, our next episode, which will be on the 24th of April at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That would be 7 p.m. London time, because London will finally move into daylight savings time. We're about 2 weeks ahead of you here on the east coast of the U.S., but no bother. So those events should be up. Those of you who don't know me, and for those of you, of course, who know me, I do a Middle Eastern history series for History Mostly Ancient and for the New York Cultural Group, which is on every Thursday. In fact, this Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to be covering Tanzimat, Ottomanism, and the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, which is basically the Ottoman Empire's modernization period. Of course, there are more presentations down the pike, especially next Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, which I believe corresponds to 6
or 5
p.m.
or 6 in Europe.
Yeah, 6 p.m. London time, because I think daylight savings time starts for you next Sunday. 6 p.m. London time, which will be a Ukraine discussion, which I will MC. Aaron will be one of the panelists. We will have other panelists as well, who will bring our expertise to explain the Ukraine situation. And you can find the sign up to that in the New York Culture Meetup and the History Mostly Ancient Meetup. I don't know if it's been publicized on London yet. So we look forward to seeing you at those events. And
in the next month, we'll continue on this and go all the way through the international relations, basically foreign policy, security policy, defense policy, and international relations as a rubric, so that our goal is that everybody understands how and why the Europeans can make these decisions or don't. And then as we introduce various crises as examples, you'll be able to, when you read things in the news or see things, you'll be able to yell at that announcer or person that's actually speaking on YouTube or whatever.
Exactly. Also, there is a playlist that we have on History Mostly Ancient that shows the previous 3 episodes. When this episode is finalized on YouTube, I will add that, and I'll put a comment for that playlist so you can see all the previous episodes if you haven't already, and you'd like to go more in depth on that first, let's say 30-40 minutes, where we discussed what we covered over the course of 6 hours, right, in much more depth. So we're so happy that you guys joined us, and we look forward to seeing you next month, if not sooner.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. All right, bye everybody.
Yep, bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks for all the hard
Thanks,
work.
Mark. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.